45 people, one island, no airport, no road out. The nearest city is more than 2,000 miles away, and the boat that brings food and fuel comes only 4 times a year. That is the easy part, because the 45 people who spend winter on this island are not the ones in charge. The ones in charge have 4 legs, sharp teeth, and they have been quietly evolving into something new. This is Kerguelen, a French territory the size of Corsica, sitting alone in the southern Indian Ocean, closer to Antarctica than to mainland France. And almost everything you have heard about it is wrong. Because Kerguelen was not discovered as desolation, it was sold to a king of France as paradise. The 45 humans who live here are not the dominant species, not even close. And the wildlife you see in the photographs, the penguins, the seals, the giant albatrosses, are not living in a sanctuary. They are living in a war zone, a war they did not start, a war they cannot win. Start with the geography, because it does not make sense. 7,215 square kilometers of rock, ice, and tundra, about 2/3 the size of the island of Corsica, roughly the same surface area as the state of Delaware. One main island called Grande Terre, surrounded by around 300 smaller islands and islets, separated by drowned valleys turned into sea straits. Now look at the location. 49 degrees south, 3,300 kilometers southeast of Madagascar, 1,950 kilometers north of Antarctica. The closest neighbor is a tiny Australian rock called Heard Island, 450 kilometers away, where nobody lives. There is no commercial flight, there is no runway, there has never been one. The only way in is by boat, a French research and supply vessel called the Marion Dufresne, leaving from Réunion Island in the western Indian Ocean. The voyage, when the weather agrees, takes about 10 days, with a stop at the Crozet archipelago halfway. When the weather does not agree, the voyage takes longer, or the boat does not arrive at all. Now imagine you live there. The supply ship comes about 4 times a year. Whatever you forgot to bring is gone for 3 months. Whatever breaks, stays broken until the next rotation. There is no hospital with a surgeon. There is no embassy. There is no exit. If you have a serious medical emergency in winter, the answer is the radio, and then waiting. And then there is the wind. Kerguelen sits inside a belt of latitude that sailors named the furious 50s. There are no continents at this latitude to break the air, so the wind circles the planet, accelerating, scraping the ocean for thousands of miles before it hits the cliffs of Grande Terre. Gusts above 100 kilometers per hour are routine. Storms above 150 are not unusual. Rain, sleet, or snow falls almost every day of the year. The temperature does not save you either. Summer high, around 7 degrees Celsius. Winter, just above freezing. It is not Antarctica, it is something stranger. A cold, wet, permanent storm that never quite turns into ice and never quite stops. Step outside the base in Port-aux-Français in winter, and you understand within seconds why this place was once called the Desolation Islands. The wind hits your face and your eyes close on their own. You cannot hear the person next to you. You cannot stand still without leaning into it. The air tastes of salt and metal, and in the gray, you start to notice that there are no trees. There have never been trees. The whole archipelago has 0 native woody plants. Just grass, moss, lichen, and one strange green vegetable, the Kerguelen cabbage, which sailors used for centuries to fight scurvy. This is where most channels would tell you Kerguelen is just a frozen rock at the end of the world. Subscribe to Impossible Lands, because in a moment, you will see why that story is the lie that has covered this place for 250 years. Because Kerguelen was not discovered as desolation, in February of 1772, a French naval officer named Yves-Joseph de Kerguelen-Tremarec was sailing the southern Indian Ocean on a secret mission for King Louis XV. France had just lost Canada to the British. It was hungry for a new colony, ideally a southern continent, the legendary Terra Australis, the great unknown landmass that European geographers were certain had to exist somewhere down there to balance the weight of the north. Kerguelen-Tremarec saw land through the fog. He did not land. He sent a single launch toward the coast, never set foot on the islands himself, and turned back to France. And when he arrived in Paris, he told the king he had found it. A new continent, forests, fields, a climate as gentle as the south of France. A territory ready to be settled, populated, exploited. The 5th continent, confirmed. The king believed him. France funded a second, much larger expedition to colonize this paradise. Kerguelen Tremarec returned with money, ships, and orders to take possession of his discovery. He arrived. He saw what he had actually found. Black cliffs, no trees, no fields, wind that knocks men down, penguins instead of populations. He turned around again, sailed home, and tried to keep the lie alive. It did not work. The truth came back with the crew. He was court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and imprisoned. 4 years later, in 1776, the British navigator James Cook arrived at the same coast on his third voyage, found the message left by the French, and renamed the place. He called it the Islands of Desolation. That is the name that stuck for the next century. A French paradise that did not exist, sold to a king, paid for with a career, corrected by an Englishman with a bitter sense of humor. Layer 1 of the lie. Pulled. Now back to the present, to the 45. In summer, the population of Kerguelen swells to around 120. Scientists, engineers, technicians, a small military detachment, a doctor, a chef, a few rotating specialists. In winter, when the weather collapses and the supply ship slows down, that number drops to about 45. They live almost entirely inside one settlement, on the eastern side of Grande Terre, on a sheltered bay called the Gulf of Morbihan. The settlement is called Port-aux-Français. The locals call it PAF. It is not a town. It is not even a village. It is a base. Around 70 buildings clustered along a flat strip of land, a shallow harbor where the supply ship cannot dock and unloads with barges, a meteorological station, a satellite tracking antenna pointed at the sky, biology and geophysics labs, a small church called Our Lady of the Winds, a bar, a gym, and a library. There is a cemetery, but you cannot use it lightly. Everything here is about the ship that is not coming today. They study the climate, the glaciers, the magnetic field, the ocean, the seabirds, the seals. They listen to satellites. They watch the ice retreat. They are, in a real sense, the eyes of France, in a part of the planet where almost nobody else is looking. And here is the detail that almost nobody mentions. The 45 do not really run the island. They run a small piece of one peninsula. Step outside that piece, and the math changes completely, because Kerguelen is not empty. Walk a few kilometers east of the base, onto the long beach called Ratmanoff, and the ground stops being ground. It becomes feathers. Roughly 150,000 pairs of king penguins, more than 300,000 birds, packed tight in one of the largest king penguin colonies on Earth. A black, white, and orange carpet that moves, breathes, and screams without stopping. The smell hits you before the sight. Ammonia, fish, the heat of 300,000 bodies pressed against the cold. In the middle of the colony, you cannot see the end of it. The chicks, brown and bigger than they should be, stand still while the adults walk between them with the formal posture of small men in tuxedos. Climb into the interior, away from the coast, and the herds appear. Around 4,000 reindeer in the southern Indian Ocean. Norwegian sailors released a small group on a neighboring island in the 1950s to provide fresh meat. The reindeer, it turns out, are excellent swimmers. They crossed the strait, colonized Grande Terre, and now form the only free-roaming reindeer population in the entire southern hemisphere, outside of one similar accident on South Georgia. Add to that around 3,500 semi-wild sheep on a smaller island, kept originally to feed the scientists. Add wild mouflon, a type of mountain sheep, also introduced. Add millions of rabbits, the descendants of a single release in 1874, when somebody decided that future shipwrecked sailors should have something to eat. Add an unknown number of black rats, an unknown number of mice, and the most efficient predator on the entire archipelago, cats. And it is the cats that turn this story from strange into something else. Before we get to them, two details that almost nobody mentions about Kerguelen. They explain the kind of place this is. The first. In November of 1940, in the middle of the Second World War, a German raiding ship called the Atlantis put into a sheltered bay on Grande Terre to take on water and to repair its hull, far from any Allied patrol. While the ship was in port, a sailor named Bernhard Herrmann fell from the funnel he was painting. He died on impact. They buried him on the beach in a place called Port Couvreau. His grave is still there. According to records, it is the southernmost German war grave of the Second World War on Earth. A single white cross surrounded by penguins. The second. The largest glacier in Kerguelen is called the Cook Ice Cap. Between 1963 and 2001, satellite measurements show its surface shrank by roughly 100 square kilometers, from about 500 to about 400. Researchers describe it as the fastest melting glacier under French sovereignty. Every year the ice retreats, every year the shape of the island changes. A piece of France, on the other side of the world, is dissolving in real time, watched by 45 people most of the year, and almost nobody else. Now, the cats. In the 1850s, whaling crews left their ship cats on Kerguelen to control rats. A century later, in the 1950s, the new French base did the same. The colonies survived. The colonies grew, and then something happened that no one planned for. On Kerguelen, the cats had no predators. They had unlimited prey: rabbits, mice, and most importantly, ground-nesting seabirds that had evolved on an island with no land predators at all. These birds, the petrels, the prions, the smaller albatrosses, do not flee from a four-legged hunter. They do not even recognize one as a threat. They sit on their nests and wait. According to studies cited by French and international researchers, the feral cats of the Kerguelen Islands kill in the order of 1.2 million seabirds every year. 1.2 million per year, from a few hundred ship cats dropped over a century and a half. Some species did not survive. Researchers estimate that introduced cats have been responsible for the extinction of around 10 species of petrel worldwide in the 20th century alone. Kerguelen is one of the documented epicenters of that quiet collapse. And then the cats started to change. Recent biological studies have documented something the original sailors could not have imagined. A subset of Kerguelen cats, isolated for generations on this archipelago, have grown larger than ordinary house cats. Specimens close to 5 kilograms. Skulls and jaws visibly reinforced compared to mainland Felis catus. Black and white coats, almost uniform across the population, the result of generations of inbreeding from a tiny founding group. Solitary hunters with territories of around 50 hectares each patrol day and night. Some of them, biologists report, have specialized in something almost no domestic cat on Earth attempts. They hunt the chicks of the wandering albatross, a bird whose adult wingspan can reach more than 3 meters, the largest flying bird in the world. The albatross chick, alone on its nest for days while its parents fly thousands of kilometers across the Southern Ocean for food, has no defense. It has never seen a land predator. Nothing in its evolution prepared it for what is coming. Picture that. A cat the size of a small terrier dragging a fledgling albatross out of a nest at night across a wind-stripped slope into a rocky cave on the edge of the Antarctic. Researchers who have studied these dens describe them as boneyards, layers of skeletons, feathers compacted into the dirt, the remains of other cats that did not survive the winter. A new predator made on French soil in a place where 45 people are watching and cannot stop it. Field experiments to control the cats around specific albatross colonies have produced limited results. Reduce the number of cats in one zone, and the chicks still die, because the surviving cats are the specialists. The ones that have learned, the ones that have built a behavior no textbook described 20 years ago. Trying to remove them from an island the size of Corsica, with no roads across most of it, with cliffs and bogs and 4 months of unbroken storm, is not a project. It is closer to a confession. This is what evolution looks like, at speed, when you change the rules of an island. So why does France stay? On paper, Kerguelen costs more than it earns. The Marion Dufresne, the base, the salaries, the science, the navy ship that patrols the surrounding waters. None of it is cheap. There is no oil rig, there is no resort, there is no airport that could ever be profitable. The islands have no native population to govern, no tax base, no strategic harbor. What they do have is everything around them. The exclusive economic zone around Kerguelen, the 200 nautical mile band of ocean that France controls because of these rocks, is enormous. Combined with the other territories of the French southern lands, it gives France one of the largest exclusive economic zones on the planet, more than 10 million square kilometers of ocean, a number that puts France, on paper, in the same conversation as the United States in terms of maritime territory. Without Kerguelen and the other southern islands, that number collapses. Inside that zone, deep, cold currents support one of the most valuable fisheries in the world, including the Patagonian toothfish, sold internationally as Chilean sea bass, one of the most expensive fish on the legal market. A single toothfish on a restaurant plate in New York or Tokyo can be traced, often, to these waters. France polices the zone with a permanent navy presence and detains illegal fishing vessels. In the early 2000s, the area was one of the most pirated fisheries on Earth. The patrols changed that. Slowly, boat by boat, add the science, add the satellite tracking, add the climate observatory in a place where the air and the sea are some of the cleanest baselines on Earth. The kind of measurements that become the reference points that everywhere else is compared to. Add the fact that, in geopolitics, an island held is an island held. Lose presence for a year, and the conversation about who controls what and who fishes what changes. 45 people in winter in a base on a wind-swept fjord are the visible part of a much larger calculation. The price of presence, the cost of keeping a piece of ocean the size of a small continent, which brings us back to where we started. 45 humans, one island the size of Corsica, no airport, no road out, a boat 4 times a year, weather permitting. From the outside, it looks like the loneliest posting on the planet. From the inside, it is something else. It is a base camp on a battlefield that nobody planned. The reindeer are still spreading. The rabbits are still chewing the soil to dust. The Cook Glacier is still retreating, faster than anything else in metropolitan or overseas France. The cats are still growing, still hunting, still changing into something that did not exist on this island 2 centuries ago. The 45 are not the rulers of Kerguelen. They are the witnesses. 1 million seabirds a year, 45 witnesses. Do the math. If a few hundred ship cats, left behind by sailors who did not even land for long, can rewrite an entire ecosystem in 150 years, what does that say about every other place on this planet where we have done the same thing without paying attention? If you want to keep watching the parts of the world that almost nobody else is willing to look at, subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Impossible Lands.